In a world where RAM costs more than already inflated high-end graphics cards, we need budget heroes who can save those of us who aren't looking to go into debt or work two jobs in order to have a good computing experience. Alright, let's just cut to the chase. The good old RTX 3060 is the equivalent of Superman. Roughly $200 used gets you a GPU that matches the 1080 Ti and 2080, don't at me, has 12GB of VRAM to play around with, excels at Blender, can decode AV1 videos, does a great job encoding HEVC, high efficiency video codec, and kinda just does everything you want it to overall. YouTube naysayers will say, but it can't use 12GB of VRAM, or the 4060 consumes way less power, bro, you don't have DLSS frames and you're screwed. Well, my good Debbie Downer, if you are watching this video, I simply have to disagree. Let's get on with it, shall we? My test system is my daily driver. Specs are on screen. CachyOS in specific has magical sauce, or cachy sauce, that alleviates some performance loss that NVIDIA GPUs have on Linux when running DX12 titles, which is pretty boss. Do keep in mind that recording on the GPU has a slight performance loss on top of that, but it's nothing crazy. Unless I state otherwise, you can expect 10-ish more frames with DirectX 12 titles. Let me start this off by saying that this footage was recorded before the performance patch that fixed many of the game's problems. I originally was going on a rant here about how awful this game was optimized and how the world was going to explode if they didn't fix it, but clearly the world's still intact, so we can move on and have a decent experience. At 1080p, DLSS 4 balanced and FSR 3 frame generation with a wide variety of low to high settings, which you can see on screen. We're getting around 85 to 90 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 60-ish. Bear with me, I don't have the 3060 anymore, so I can't go back and record. Anyways, Wilds is perfectly playable. Granted, it is still Monster Hunter Wilds, and no game should need frame gen and aggressive upscaling to hit 60 FPS. Capcom, please. But it used to be worse, and more updates are coming. So the 3060 may actually be a good choice for the game if you're on a budget and have a 75 or 100Hz FreeSync monitor for those generated frames. I was able to do the first tutorial hunt without wanting to rip my hair out from the latency, which is good. Continuing on with Tekken 8, where, well, it's a fighting game. Historically, fighting games on PC have almost always had really good releases that can run at 1080p 60 FPS with decent settings, even on very low-end cheapo hardware. For a lot of reasons, mainly because the fighting game community is broke. As such, I'm running the game at 1080p, max settings, DLSS 4 quality, and getting a locked 60. Not really surprising given this game also looks good and runs great on both the Steam Deck and Xbox Series S. You don't need DLSS quality to hit that 1080p 60 either. Temporal Super Resolution, or TSR, at 100% for anti-aliasing hits that as well. However, DLAA didn't want to work through launch options today, and DLSS 4 quality looks better than TSR anyway. Elden Ring is unfortunately one of those games that has a myriad of issues on different platforms, but at 1080p high, we're getting an average of 60 frames per second with a 1% low of 50-ish. This means I can't blame the game for the fact that I couldn't 360 no-scope this guy, but it's whatever. What matters is that it runs and runs very well even without DLSS, because this game doesn't even have DLSS to begin with despite implementing ray tracing. Yes, this game has ray tracing, and if you turn it on, well, I didn't record it, but it gets pretty bad. At the end of the day, Elden Ring looks and runs great on hardware that will run it great. Just don't turn ray tracing on. Titanfall 2 runs great at 1080p maximum settings. This is just a private match where I'm flying around Angel City, doing some movement, so do keep in mind that a proper multiplayer match will most likely run a bit slower. We're getting a solid 118 FPS average with a 1% low of 70, and most people are going to be turning down settings to hit their monitor's refresh rate anyway, but for older AAA titles, the 3060 will shred through them with no issue. Let's be real here, of course it would. It's a 1080 Ti with a new code of ray tracing and upscaling paint, and everyone knows how good that card was in its heyday. And look, if you were to play the game's campaign, do you really need more than 60 FPS? Unless you're a speedrunner, probably not. Apex Legends, on the other hand, does run better than Titanfall 2 at the cost of looking slightly worse, like 200 frames per second at competitive settings decimating it, but that game isn't part of the benchmarks today. Sonic Frontiers is a tragedy, but this is a GPU benchmark and us PC gamers have a tragedy every other week, so surely it can't be that bad. Anyways, working at 1080p 60 FPS at max settings. because 60 FPS is the FPS cap. Anyways, it's a pretty stable 60 FPS with a 1% low of 53, and it does just kind of work well. It's not a stutter fest like a lot of games releasing today, but the pop-in is notoriously bad, even on the PlayStation 5, whose only purpose in life was to alleviate that sort of thing. You absolutely do not need a 3060 tier card to enjoy this game or play it at 60 FPS. It works on a lot of different cards, even on my old RX 590. You really don't need that to enjoy any Sonic game. You know, I really don't have much else to say, but I'm not going to pretend like this is groundbreaking, which is pretty much the state of Sega in 2026. Obviously, vanilla Minecraft is going to run well on this thing, so let's just skip right to shaders. Using the mods on screen at 1080p, default settings with size of 12 chunk render distance, using the BSL shaders on its Ultra preset, and the 3060 is still hitting above 60 FPS no issue. In fact, it's comfortably hitting 90 to 100. Using the render scale mod, we can bump the resolution up to 4K where it's still outputting about 40 to 50 frames per second. Of course, whether or not you actually like playing Minecraft with shaders is up to you. Without them, I get a little more than 60 FPS. There are also lighter shaders that the 3060 could easily run at 4K 60. I just chose BSL as a nice middle ground because the harder to run shaders don't really look that much better. To be fair to the RTX 3060, emulators are almost entirely CPU bound, but my Ryzen 5 5600 can handle almost everything you throw at it, even with my jank-ass RAM setup. The solution here is turning up the resolution. Here we have Nintendo Switch emulation. Of course, I don't condone piracy, but emulation does not require piracy to work at all anyway, and I own these games, so it just feels completely redundant to say that. First, Metroid Prime Remastered running at roughly 1800p as 2xing the game's internal dock resolution of 900p gets you 1800p at 120 frames per second with no issues or slowdowns whatsoever, with the only hitches being due to shader compilation. Plus, Metroid Prime is cool, so that's a nice bonus. Next, Link's Awakening running at 4K 60 FPS without the frame rate issues that the original console had. This game specifically is notoriously difficult to emulate for systems that would otherwise play other Switch titles just fine. Okay, well, none of this is actually taxing the GPU whatsoever, both of us can agree on that. Switch emulation is heavily CPU bound, and you still need a CPU like the 14900K or the 7800 X2D to take on games like Tears of the Kingdom at a rock solid, no issue, no BS 60 frames per second, which I don't have yet. Here is Dolphin emulator, specifically Mario Kart Double Dash running at 8K, like you need that, runs full speed, no issues, but turning on 2x multi-sampled anti-aliasing does present some slowdown, but lighter games will probably be just fine, and you could probably just run Dolphin games at 4K, they're Wii games. Next, Metal Gear Solid 4 at 1440p runs just fine as well, kinda, because PlayStation 3 emulation is still very difficult no matter how good your system is. For a system like mine, the game runs at a near lock 60 FPS at 1080p, for the most part, and 40 to 60 at 1440p. 4K starts having drops below 40, and we actually seem to be CPU bound as well. And you're probably thinking, why? I thought less resolution equals more CPU bound. And that is true, but this is the PlayStation 3 and emulation is... We are ignoring shader compilation stutters here as that has nothing to do with the graphics card, but yeah. As you can see, the RTX 3060 itself can handle emulation just fine for the most part, and again, emulation is heavily CPU bound. So if you have a first gen Ryzen or an older Xeon, you probably won't be hitting specifically the Switch and PlayStation 3 results, but Dolphin and literally everything else minus Xbox 360 emulation will be just fine. In conclusion, the RTX 3060 offers some insane value in 2026 for practically everyone. Of course, I'm talking about a used RTX 3060. You're not going to be getting a warranty, but a good rule of thumb is that if you throw Furmark at it for 30 minutes to an hour and it's stable, no issues, it'll last you for many, many years. If you absolutely 100% can't accept anything else must buy new, well, I think you should have an open mind, because realistically the only good deal is the Intel Arc B570, which comes in about $250. But Intel cards are still kind of experimental at the end of the day. The drivers, they're better than they were before by a long shot. They're still not as good or stable as AMD or Nvidia drivers, because AMD drivers are never bad. But given Intel's shoddy driver situation on both Windows and Linux, and the well, still awful price to performance compared to a used GPU. Like, you can even get a 3070 for roughly $250 less in some cases. I just can't recommend a B570 in good faith. Anyways, thank you all for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe, check out my Substack link below, and comment about what you think of the current situation in tech, you know, the RAM crisis and all of that. Anyways, peace out.